Why does Indonesia own this? The eastern half of the island of New Guinea today belongs to Papua New Guinea, named for the native Papuans who call it home. So why does Indonesia control the West? In this video, we'll talk about how colonization, diplomacy, and more than a little violence left half of the world's second largest island under the Indonesian flag. The Papuans were a relatively small population, living mostly in the island's center. With no great cities, the Europeans didn't think much of them. The Spanish named the island New Guinea, since it reminded them of Guinea in Africa, but mostly left it alone. That changed with the Dutch, who arrived permanently in the 19th century. They already controlled much of the East Indies and set up a few small ports on the western part of the island. The island was mostly a buffer zone against rival European power for more valuable Dutch-controlled islands west of it. The Dutch ruled it indirectly via the Sultan of Tidore, and no more than a few hundred Dutch colonists settled on the island at any one time. In 1848, the British also showed an interest and agreed to divide the claims to the island with the Dutch. Aside from a small bump around the Fly River, this straight line didn't reflect any reality on the ground. It was just a convenience for the colonial powers to do it that way. After 1848, the British colonized some parts of the eastern island, but the Germans also muscled in for their short-lived colonial empire and carved off a chunk too. That was until 1914, when the First World War broke out, and the British, or more accurately Australian troops fighting for the British Empire, captured it from them. After the war, Australia took control of the eastern half, and aside from Japanese occupation during the Second World War, they remained under Australian control until their independence as Papua New Guinea in 1975. In contrast, Western New Guinea would have a much rougher experience, as its Dutch colonial masters relinquished their overseas empire. With the end of the Second World War, Indonesia demanded its independence. A sense of shared identity spread among the former Dutch East Indies, hardening in the fact of Japanese brutality, and the thought of returning to the control of another foreign occupier after the war was unacceptable. Sukarno and Muhammad Hatta declared Indonesians' independence on August 17, 1945, just 2 days after Japan's formal surrender. A protracted political and armed conflict with the Dutch followed, as the European power made a futile attempt to reassert its control. Western New Guinea, usually just called Papua, or West Irian to Indonesians, sat oddly in the decolonization process. With a relatively small native population, an even smaller Dutch presence, and no real representation in Indonesia's independence movement, nor Dutch administration, the voice and perspective of its people was largely ignored. Indonesia's view at first was mixed. Hatta's initial thoughts were that Papua should be independent, saying that it should be left to the Papuan people themselves. I recognize that the Papuans have the right to be an independent nation. This opinion did not win out. A hardening attitude to the Dutch and the discovery of oil made it impossible for Indonesia to pass up the area they dubbed West Irian. The 1946 Linggadjati Agreement with the Dutch had implied that Indonesia would be entitled to all former territory of the Dutch East Indies. When serious fighting erupted in the following years, the Dutch considered the agreement voided and had never explicitly promised them Papua anyway, while the Indonesians upheld their claim. By the late 1940s, Indonesia considered Papua as much theirs as Bali or Java were. Meanwhile, a right-wing turn in Dutch politics encouraged them to double down on retaining what little of the empire they could. Papua became a symbol, a last bastion of a dying Dutch imperial glory. Still, even the Dutch realized it would not hold on to Papua forever. They committed to Papua's future independence, but insisted it could only come after several decades of further Dutch guidance. Both Indonesia and the Dutch claimed to be speaking for the interest of the Papuans without truly asking them. Indonesia achieved full independence in 1949. The Dutch could not prevent it, and the US had threatened to withdraw Marshall Plan aid from the Netherlands if they continued to oppose it. The Hague Conference that same year hoped to settle the Papua issue, but negotiations got nowhere. The Papua question was kicked down the road and left unresolved as the new nation came into being. In the meantime, the Dutch expanded their colonial administration in Papua. Even into the 1950s, Dutch control did not extend much beyond the coastline. The thickly jungled and hilly center of the island, where most Papuans lived, was beyond their ability to govern in any meaningful way. It was estimated that no more than 25% of Papua's population was under any effective Dutch authority, even by the late 1950s. The Dutch doubled down on their control, though. In 1952, they amended their constitution to include Papua as an integral part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They also presented their continued occupation as an anti-communist move in Southeast Asia. Indonesia's assertion of neutrality in the Cold War, which Washington and its allies interpreted as covert communist sympathies, made this claim more believable. For its part, Indonesia kept the Irian question near the top of the agenda. It earned support for its claims from a number of countries, including India, and made repeated attempts in the United Nations to get a resolution passed in support, to no avail. As Jakarta's frustration grew, tensions remained high. President Sukarno agreed to Soviet military aid for a potential military solution, and nationalized a number of Dutch industries in the country, bringing the specter of the Cold War deeper into events. In 1960, he broke off relations with the Netherlands in protest over the dispute. The Dutch continued with their gradual independence plan. In February 1961, they established a governing council composed largely of Papuans and proposed the Luns Plan for a UN-supervised transition into full independence. On December 1st that year, the semi-formal Republic of West Papua was declared, with ceremonies in Papua and a new flag to boot. Sukarno was furious. The idea of a self-determining Papua had long been abandoned by the Indonesian leadership. Within weeks, the Indonesian government began Operation Trikora, under which they inserted paratroopers and Marines into Papua to disrupt the remaining Dutch forces and oppose any Papuan independence groups. On January 15, 1952, one of these insertions was interrupted by the Dutch Navy, leading to a brief encounter named the Battle of Arafura Sea, resulting in almost 40 Indonesian sailors and Marines killed. Operation Trikora had a limited effect. Only a small number of troops were ever inserted on the island, and violence was light, resulting in few casualties or deaths. Part of the reason for this was the timely intervention of the US. President Kennedy recognized the serious risk of elevation and stepped in. His sympathies lay with Indonesia, and in 1962 told the Netherlands directly that NATO would not back them if the conflict erupted. He forced both sides to negotiate, and a few months later, Indonesia and the Netherlands signed the New York Agreement to end the Papua question once and for all. Under the New York Agreement, the Dutch relinquished all claims to Papua, while Indonesia would take it over, on the condition that Papua would decide their own fate in an act of free choice within a few years. Papuan political parties were banned, and public support for Papuan independence became a criminal offense. The Indonesians selected 1,000 delegates to vote on their country's behalf. The delegates chose unanimously to join Indonesia. Papuans had little power to resist, but they wielded that little power where they could. Free Papua movement engages in a guerrilla war that continues to this day. Technically, the conflict is still ongoing, but it's considered to be a low-intensity conflict, with few casualties in any given year. It's difficult to gauge Papuan support for independence, but there's no reason to expect such a change anytime soon. And that line drawn by the Dutch and British back in 1848 continues to shape the fate of the entire island.